Welcome back for another installment of Fellowship of the Rink. With me here in person, live from Legends out in Prior Lake, Joe Smith, bringing you all the insider info on Minnesota Wild, and today, particularly, Gopher hockey.
Yeah, the Gophers Alumni golf tournament, second annual one they put together, and guys from the 02 championship team, back-to-back championship teams, to newly minted, signed Wild defenseman Brock Faber was a late addition to a fun foursome or fivesome there. I think they have with Kester and Snuggerud and stuff like that playing. So a lot of new and old greats for the Minnesota Gophers, Golden Gophers playing today. It should be a lot of beers to be had, a lot of foot wedges to be used, a lot of hijinks to be happening. And I'm sure this place won't close down for a while, but have a lot of fun show for you today. Had a bunch of the guys from Nate Schmidt, Brady Shea to Jordan Leopold and Paul Martin, a few other guys come on for some fun chat about golf, Gophers, and their career. So we'll hit that up after this one.
Yeah, that'll probably be in the next week or so here that we'll be dropping all of those. But lots of fun, lots of great guys here, and hopefully get a little bit more long-form stuff for you guys down the road with them. Today, Joe, we're going to keep it simple because there's nothing too exciting on the Minnesota Wild front necessarily, but given that we've got a great guest here that we banked for you guys the other week, and thank you all for throwing in questions if you did. But Scott Wheeler, basically everything go-to for the NHL draft for the Athletic, gave us a pretty deep interview. So we won't spend a ton of time here on the preamble, but since we have that, figured we'd lead in with just where some of the fans sit. And again, this is a small sample. This isn't like when Joe and Russo throw up their polls on an Athletic article. Those we're talking thousands here. We got a sample size of like 350, but still gives us at least an idea of where some people's heads are at. First one that I threw out there was, which Wild forward prospect are you the most excited about? Joe, the options were Riley Heidt, Marat Huznadinov, Liam Ogren, Danila Yurov. Where do you think the fan opinion fell?
I'd say Yurov would be my guess. I think Ogren gave a really good showing and end of the season there, so he could be one that could probably get some votes. But I would probably think that Yurov, since he's the kind of one that people haven't seen yet, but people have heard so much about.
Yeah, and it's really funny because, like, depending on what social media platform you go on, it is like wildly different. If this was posted on YouTube exclusively, it would have been overwhelmingly Marat Huznadinov, because that's all we hear about on YouTube. But it was 52% Danila Yurov, 20% Riley Heidt, 19% Liam Ogren, 9% Marat Huznadinov. And there were a couple people in the comments that were doing a little bit of fighting and defending of Marat, but I think kind of falls right in line with what we're talking about. And it's funny because he's the only one that will absolutely not be in the lineup this year. Maybe at the end of the year,
maybe at the end if he signs, like, Marat signed last year after his team was out of the playoffs. So in theory, it's possible. But yeah, I think the plan is for one more year in the KHL and then come over and be part of the lineup next season, 25-26 the year. But yeah, like we go over with Scott Wheeler in this podcast. One of the questions you guys asked is if he would have come over this year, would he be a top six guy? And so he had to answer that question for us. So definitely exciting player. His move to center from the wing for a lot of cases was really big for him and really big for the Wild, potentially to have him up the middle in the center position. So definitely a lot to be excited about for him. As far as Riley Heidt, we asked about him as well, since he's one of those guys that will probably be the main focus in training camp, I would think, since he'll be in town, the one guy that hasn't played the NHL level of those guys that will be here. Marat has, and obviously Ogren has, and Heidt will have a lot to prove should he get that 9-game tryout, should he be on the roster. And so I think, Scott, that'll be one that I think we'll be all writing about in that September period.
At least it's something too that's a bright spot, right? It's not to say that things are all doom and gloom for the Wild. It's more just like it's felt very like stagnant, stale, and at least having the wrinkle of like Ogren and Heidt likely fighting for the same roster spot. A lot of excitement around the guys, and hopefully one of them is breaking through and playing in that middle six.
Yeah, and there's now been a lot of roster turnover the last couple of years, right? And so, like, the things that excite you as writers or give you something to write about is like new guys, right? New guys, new personalities and profiles, and positions up for grabs. And last couple of years, there haven't been a lot of either, right? Like Pat Maroon came in a trade. You have some other guys that, but now, you have Yakov Trenin, which will be a new piece, of course. And, but having the influx of the youth and the prospects that people have been interested about all the time, the Jesper Wallstedts of the world as well. So I think Riley Heidt will be watched and played a lot in the preseason. And I think like Scott said in our podcast, like, why not give him that time? If you have the cap space, why not give him the 9-game tryout, see how he does, see how he adjusts to it, give him a taste and see, hey, maybe, if you sink or swim and you maybe don't play as well, that'll give you some motivation going back to WHL or going to World Juniors and saying, hey, okay, this is what I have to work on. So as long as they have the cap space, which we don't know if they will have the cap space, depending on what they carry going into the season, give the kid a shot to see what he can do.
Absolutely. And like you said, too, new personalities, new characters. We've had these guys on recently. Anyone that's just tuning in for the first time or kind of picks and chooses their spots, it's the summer. Some people are completely turned off of hockey, and I understand it. But episode 23, Liam Ogren, episode 21, Riley Heidt, and I'd even recommend episode 19, Hunter Haight, a guy that I wanted to put on this list, but thanks Twitter, I can only put 4 guys on as a poll option. And if I had left any of these 4 off, people would have rioted. So, but all of those, go back, check them out. These are guys that we're really excited to, hopefully be pieces of this team for quite some time moving forward. Next question, Joe, which Wild prospects development outside of, Minnesota Wild, Iowa Wild, we're kind of scrapping those, looking outside. Which are you most interested in following their development this season?
Join us in the Brainerd Lakes area this Labor Day weekend for the CRMC Championship presented by Gertens at Cragen's Legacy Courses. Last year's PGA Tour America's Tournament of the Year kicks off Thursday, August 30th, with free admission for everyone. VIP tickets are available and could go fast, so do not wait to claim access to 3 hospitality areas that have your food and beverage needs covered. Last year, Faber, Shaw, Addison, and Walker were out in full force supporting their teammate and one of your favorite Minnesota Wild players in Matt Boldy. Who knows which Wild players you might run into this year, not to mention 2-time Stanley Cup champion Sean Chambers getting in on the action. Don't miss the Saturday Night Jam on the 18th green featuring The Hype. This is your chance to watch the next PGA Tour superstar right here in Brainerd, Minnesota. For more information, visit crmcchampionship.com.
4 guys we threw out there were Aaron Kiviharju, Rasmus Kumpalainen, Ryder Ritchie, and Charlie Stramel.
Yeah, I mean, I think Aaron for me is one of them because as he told Bill Guerin, I'm the steal of the draft, right? Just seeing how he develops and plays this year will be, I think like Scott mentioned, he could play the World Junior team there for Finland. But I mean, I think the easy answer here and one I think is truthful for me is Charlie Stramel. Just because of how he was a first-round pick, how it's been a rough couple of years, and getting that fresh start and reset button with Michigan State, and seeing how he can maybe, revive a little bit. It's hard to say reviving a career when the guy's like 22 years old or something like that, right? Like it's very rough to hear. Sometimes people are kind of already thrown out as a prospect after just a year or two. So
yeah,
but I think this will be a very important year for him. Reestablish some of that confidence in his game, be more imposing with his size, and maybe play with a faster pace. And he's not going to be a point per game player, but a guy who can maybe chip in offensively, not be just a 4th line grinder. So obviously the Wild were excited for a reason to take him. It was obviously much criticized, or there's a lot of debate in the draft any year, no matter what it is, but in that year, especially with Gabe Perreault and other ones that were around then. So, but I think just having the change of scenery and having a new team, the coach that knows him, I think that'll be really good for him this year.
I think so too. And I think it is unfair, the, hate, I'll even say, that's been thrown his way so far. But we were going through, we did a collab that we do twice a year with, I guess, formerly known as Selling the Foghorn guys on Judd's Buds, where we rank the entire prospect pool based on everyone's cumulative numbers. And I was the highest on Stramel at 13. But that's also to say, I think we're all like in the teens, and we're all either going to be way too high or way too low after this season. Like, this season is the season for him to prove what he can be. And like you said, it doesn't have to be point a game player, but no more excuses. Like, he's had excuses the last couple of years. We're defending him, and we think that he's still the player that Judd drafted. Judd has said as much when he came on with us, but this year needs to be the show out, or like, he's either moving into my top 10 or he's moving outside of my top 20, you know?
Well, you want to prove you can be a professional hockey player, right? He's got to prove he needs to get signed, and then he'll maybe get a chance to go to the AHL, and depending how long he wants to stay in school, or maybe he stays in school another year. Well, we don't know that, but this will be probably the biggest year where we'll have the most eyeballs on him. I'm sure Minnesota Wild, and not just them, but overall, to see if he's a guy that could be part of that future. And, not to say that they don't need a desperate rush to get him to the Minnesota Wild lineup, but they want to know if he can be that kind of option that can fill in their prospect or in their roster in the next 2-3 years, which he very well still could be. It may not be the role people think of, a top 15, 16 pick, whatever like that, but he can be a guy that can, if you be a big third line center that can play on your second power play, that can be in the PK, that can, win draws and stuff like that. That's still a valuable resource to have in your lineup. So if that's a ceiling for him, I think they would take it.
For sure. And so the numbers broke down, Charlie Stramel, 43%. I wasn't sure how that was going to go, because some people have completely written him off, but yeah. I would vote Charlie too. But Aaron Kiviharju, 28, Rasmus Kumpelainen, 16. I actually thought he would be a lot higher. Just like the profile of player is fascinating to me. Just like his body, the way he uses it. Now we've seen him go from Finland, playing in the OHL. Now he's going back because his dream was to play for his hometown Pelicans. Mm-hmm. And we're just going to, he's the guy that just has the widest range of outcomes for me in like a good way. Like, this is a guy that I think projects as an NHL player, but it's like, what kind of NHL player will he truly become? And it's going to be fun to kind of see what he does going back and playing against men at this young age.
Yeah, that's a big part of his development, is seeing how he responds to that. And, like we said, it's hard to project where he'll be, whether it'll be like a depth piece, a guy who plays AHL and then, steps in at the NHL level and a call-up thing, or maybe as a kind of a bottom six kind of guy. But, anytime you have a guy with his upside or his ability, that you have a chance to, if you exceed expectations, even from a fan or from a media or from a team standpoint. So I think it's one of those cases where we'll see a lot more after this year of where he is, and if he gets a chance to play internationally and that kind of thing too.
Yeah. And then the last one we have here, which Minnesota Wild defensive prospect are you most willing to trade? And I kind of asterisk this as like, assume this is a piece in a larger deal. This isn't like we're shipping a guy away because we don't want him. The guys we listed: Zeev Buium, Damon Hunt, Carson Lambos, Jack Peart.
Yeah, that's a good one, because they'd all be trades for different reasons. I think Damon Hunt's a guy that I think at least people in the NHL have seen at the NHL level. He's a guy who might be squeezed out here this year, especially if they have 7 defensemen. Chisholm re-signed. You still have John Merrill unless they move him or do something like that. So I think he's a guy who might not be won't be a blockbuster trade or a big thing, but I think he'd be a guy that teams would like. The one, when you think about this, it's like which guys have value or which guys would have value for other teams. And I think Lambos is an intriguing one to me, because I think there's still a chance for him in the Wild organization. Like, I like him as a kid. I like him as a professional hockey player. Like, he's learning. I spent time in Iowa last year talking with him and talking with the coaching staff there. They still believe in what he can do. But he might be one of those guys as a former first-round pick too. The other teams might take a chance on as well, just because they know there's the potential is there. So yeah, maybe guys like that do need a fresh start somewhere else to get where they need to go. So not that personally I'm advocating to trade this guy, but I think that of guys that might draw interest from other teams, which is what you need to make a trade happen. And like Zeev Buium is a guy who'll be in the lineup potentially at the end of the season, a top 4 guy. They've signed Jake Middleton for 4 more years. They have Spurgeon under contract. They have Brodin under contract. Faber's under contract forever. So the blue line is pretty, Bogosian's under contract for another year after this. So if they get Buium up here and maybe another, the cupboard is kind of pretty full there as far as NHL level. So there is room if you have some depth defensively in your prospect pool, even though they're not maybe high upside, exciting depth. A lot of teams will maybe say if they can kind of take that player and mold him into the player that people saw initially when they were first round picks.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this is the one that got the most comments too. There was a lot of battle back and forth, and it's Lambos did end up leading the pack on this one, but some it's because, oh, he was bad last year. He's a bust. Get him out of here. Others were like, no, like, I don't want to trade Boyum. That's not an option for me, but like Lambos is the next most valuable. So if you want to try and get something back decent, like I'm okay throwing him in because I'm not sure what his path is with the Wild. So Lambos came in at 36. Pert came in at 32. Hunt at 25, and Boyum somehow 7. I don't know. That's
I don't know who the 7% are, but that's not going to happen. So he's going to be big part of the future for this team for quite a while. But
I can already picture Boyum and Faber like for a decade. It's just beautiful.
And especially how good he played last year, and to give another year of development in Denver with a world-class program there, and potentially could see him in the Frozen Four again in St. Louis this year, which I've been covering the Frozen Four every year, which has been a lot of fun. So would be fun to cover him in the Frozen Four if they do again getting there.
That would be a
and
lot.
The team that I've embedded with the last couple of years have lost.
Yeah, you stay away from the Gophers this year, Joe.
Yeah,
not allowed.
Did the Gophers a couple of years ago. Did the BU last year. Which was fun with Celebrini behind the scenes there, and obviously Jay Pandolfo owns a heck of a program there. A fun group to be around. It's just I don't think it's my fault necessarily, but 2 times it's okay. That was 3 years in a row. Then.
Yeah, 2 times is coincidence. 3 times
people might start losing my number or email address if I start hitting them up around March or April. Hey,
Joe,
how's it going?
Can I advocate that if North Dakota happens to make the Frozen Four, can you please wedge yourself in with them?
I will happily put my request in. I would love to spend time and get the other side from a lot of fans here. A lot of hatred towards, especially a lot of people on this golf course right now probably have a lot of hatred for North Dakota.
Yeah, it's funny because I almost, with like our list of questions, I was almost going to ask like, who do you hate more, North Dakota or Wisconsin? I would have said North Dakota. That's the right answer. It's the correct answer. Oh, all right. Well, enough of us talking about prospects when we know nothing near the level of information that Scott Wheeler does. So let's just kick that over here to him.
This interview is brought to you by our friends at Waggle Golf. Waggle Golf believes what you wear on the course should reflect your individuality, who you are, where you're from, your hobbies, interests, and passions. All the stuff that makes you, well, you. That's why every design is inspired by the desire to create a piece of apparel that strikes a chord when you see it, that makes you say, wow, that was made for me. Because in a lot of ways, it was. Ready to get your waggle on? Go to getyourwaggleon.com, throw in promo code SP10 at checkout to take 10% off your entire order. Joining the show today is national reporter for The Athletic, covering NHL draft prospects, Scott Wheeler. Scott, appreciate you jumping on with us.
Thanks for having me, fellas. It's we're getting back into the swing of things. The hockey season is back upon us here in August, so I'm just sort of ramping up now, and we're ready to go. The Hlinka World Junior Summer Showcase rookie tournaments are around the corner. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, the classic 3-week break that most people in hockey get.
Yeah, I took 2.5 off, and that's actually, other than for my paternity leave, my parental leave, that 2.5 week stretch was the longest I've taken off in 8 years at the Athletic. So it was nice to unplug for a little bit before heading down to Plymouth for the summer showcase.
Having just gone through some of my parental leave, Scott, I can vouch for how odd it is to not work or write for a number of weeks in a row. It was kind of
big
like
time. Big time.
6 weeks in a row, you're like, okay, this is, I know it's the summer, but still, you kind of get the itch a little bit.
Yeah, and the first, I've had 2 kids at the Athletic, and our first son, I was writing a book during it, so it didn't really feel like parental leave, if you will. So, it's hard in our business to unplug, and my schedule is such that in the summer you've got all of these other events, and then at Christmas time, when people typically take some time off, I'm off to the World Juniors. So I just don't get that typical flow of the hockey season, really.
Yeah, and we typically open up with a wild question, but it just seems so fitting. How can we make this about the Toronto Maple Leafs? Talk about your book.
Yeah, it was a real joy to put together. Obviously, the NHL draft is my bag, and so when they approached me, it wasn't typically you go to a publisher with an idea, right? This was the reverse. This was the publisher coming to me with an idea. And so when they approached me, they kind of wanted initially to do just kind of a history of the Toronto Maple Leafs at the NHL draft. And I kind of flipped it back to them and said, okay, what if we jumped? What if we didn't do every draft? What if it was just sort of behind the scenes stories, and let's do 20 chapters and 20 great stories from the draft, and I can report it out and speak to people, and we can do it that way rather than it being kind of an encyclopedia. So that's what it became. And I spoke to 60 or 70 people for the book, former GMs, former players, former scouts, agents who were involved with players, family members of players, that kind of a thing, and just sort of pieced together over the course of a 2-year process these sort of 20 stories, beginning with Walt McKechnie, the first player they ever took, and sort of sitting down with Walt McKechnie. He's actually got a restaurant in cottage country where my family now lives, and so I know Walt a little bit. He's actually a town councilor up there. Mm-hmm. So sort of sitting down with Walt McKechnie to go over what the draft was like in its very first sort of experience, and then all the way to the lottery night with Brendan Shanahan and what was going through his mind when he cracked that big smile on TV when they infamously got Austin Matthews and all that stuff. So it was, and some weird stories that people had never heard in between. You get stories about them not even scouting Mike Modano and Teemu Selanne because they didn't have the budget, and sort of great behind the scenes look at how they missed on some players, how they hit on some others, trading Tuukka Rask, all of that. So it was a ton of fun.
Now, typically, some teams are more protective than others, especially with their scouts, making them available. I know with this is the benefit of having some history or nostalgia, or guys that are no longer work for the organization. How are the Leafs in terms of being receptive to, well, obviously Shanahan talks, so he's part of the organization, but how are they to this book?
Yeah, the Leafs gave me Shanny. They gave me Wendell. They ended up giving me 4 or 5 people. I probably made 8 or 9 requests to the Leafs, and they gave me 4 or 5. They were fine. Working with them was fine throughout the book. They didn't stand in my way really on anything. But the vast majority of the people I spoke to are people that are out of the organization, sort of former scouts that are now with other teams, or former scouts that are retired, or GMs. I spoke with almost every single GM from the start of the draft through till now. The Leafs didn't make Kyle Dubas. He was one of the people that they didn't make available to me. I think they didn't want sort of inside baseball on how they make their picks with their current GM at the time, to sort of speak with me for the book. But I was really happy when they made Shanny available, and Shanny was great. The chapter that Shanny did with me was awesome, sort of going through the process with Austin Matthews, and specifically that lottery night and what it was like back then. It's no longer like that. Now they have everybody on Zooms, but Shanny's lottery was really the last one where 16 NHL general managers were all in the room, and they were stepping off camera one at a time. And it was a very, very unique night for Austin Matthews' lottery. And he sort of shakes Kevin Cheveldayoff's hand, and Kevin Cheveldayoff walks off screen. And then Shanny said he basically couldn't help himself, but he cracks this huge, infamous smirk. So that was some great theater, and sort of he walked me through his head during the commercial breaks and what he was thinking as it came down. Like it was sort of really great the way he walked me through it. So the Leafs were fine. They didn't give me everybody I was looking for, but they gave me some of the big ones. So
what's better though, the Shanny smirk or the Sakic scowl?
Yeah, both pretty good. And I was on a pod with some Detroit Red Wings fans a week ago, and they've obviously infamously had the worst luck. They've almost moved back every single time, and they still got Moritz Seider and Lucas Raymond and some guys, but they didn't get the luck at the end of their dynasty. They were in the lottery a lot, and are now obviously trying to work their way out. So it can go both ways. It's worked out well for the New Jersey Devils and the Edmonton Oilers and the Leafs, obviously. But there are teams like Detroit that have never won it that are itching, and as a result struggling to find star players to play in their core, right? Like Dylan Larkin good enough? The answer is probably not, right? They need more in Detroit, and the lottery can play a huge role in that. And sometimes it just comes down to the lottery balls, if you will, right?
That is a fact.
Well, as you know, our podcast is called Fellowship of the Rink, a nod to some Lord of the Rings fandom for us. Yep. Curious if you're a LOR fan, or what's your nerd itch, I guess, if you are if you were to say, like, you collect stuff, is there some, like, a movie or book series you're all over, or what's your nerd edge?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of Lord of the Rings, grew up on the movies. They were kind of my era, if you will. My big nerd thing growing up, less so now, but growing up, me and my brothers used to play Magic the Gathering. That was our sort of collector's thing. My brother worked at my oldest brother worked at a game store, and we would go and do drafts at the local game store. And we played a lot of MTG in my teenage years. So that was probably the big thing growing up that all three of us bonded over. We'd go up to the cottage at Christmas and crack open packs and draft and build decks and play each other. And so MTG was probably it for me growing up.
Nice.
The draft going to centralized, decentralized, it kind of surprised a lot of people, or affect a lot of people's jobs and everything like that. How will it affect you think? And what do you think about the idea of it not going from out with a bang, of course, in Vegas, but how that might change things for teams and for reporters like you who cover the draft?
Yeah, I don't love it. Certainly, there will just be less people there. I mean, as well as anyone that the real benefit of the draft isn't that we're there to talk to the players and sort of tell their stories. Obviously, that's great, and it's a huge night for them, and we like to capture it. But the real benefit of that week has traditionally been the time that you get to spend with people without their PR people standing in front of them, with general managers and directors of scouting, and everybody is there. And that is no longer going to be the case. By all accounts, the top prospects will still be there. Their agents will still be there. You'll have a representative from each team that I wouldn't expect to be the director or the general manager. I expect that all of those people will stay home. They might have celebrity representatives representing the teams instead. And the night is just going to look a lot different than it has. I also think from a fan perspective, it's going to be watered down. I think one of the things to the NHL's credit that they've done better than other leagues over the years, I think, is the draft. I think it's one of the products that the NHL had kind of perfected. It's the only time of the year that you get to see extremely private people. We know how private hockey managers are. People like Lou Lamoriello, Steve Yzerman. You get to see people who don't like to be in front of the camera. You get to see how the sausage is made. I thought it was a great spectacle the way that it was built in the past. I thought they knocked Vegas out of the park. So it's disappointing. It's not going to look or feel the same. It's not going to have the same ambiance. The product on TV, I think, for fans who are watching at home is going to be worse. I think they may move back. There is a lot of chatter. I've spoken with multiple directors and multiple general managers who said if they voted today that they would switch their vote from a no or from a yes on decentralization to a no on decentralization. So I don't think this is the last of it. I think they're going to test it out next year, see what it looks like, see how people feel about it. I think when the next CBA reopens in 2 years, they're going to completely rejig the schedule, which is really the gripe that most general managers and directors had, was the time between the draft and free agency was too short. Travel in and out of cities was often a problem. People had big issues a year ago, right before they voted in Nashville, which I think made people that was in the back of their mind. The travel nightmares coming in and out of Nashville was in the back of people's minds. I do think we're going to have another centralized draft at some point. I do think they're going to re-vote at some point and open up, potentially going back to the old format. There's even been some talk about doing it in Vegas every year kind of thing. So the door isn't completely closed, but I do think next year, because this vote has been so recently and they're not going to re-vote overnight, I do think next year we're going to see a different format and they'll see how they feel about it. And then they'll likely, in the next CBA, go back to teams and say, okay, if we can get you more of a cushion between the draft and free agency, how do you feel about going back to the classic format?
Sure. And obviously the draft, and I'd say the last month or so leading up, is essentially your Super Bowl. What's the day-to-day throughout the season, though? Like, obviously there's different milestones, big tournaments, but like, what is a day in the life of Scott Wheeler?
Yeah, so obviously I hit all the major events. So Memorial Cup, U18 Worlds, World Juniors, selection camps, rookie tournaments, all that stuff, the top prospects games. Now the CHL top prospects game is officially no more, but typically the CHL top prospects game and the USHL All-American game are both happen in January. The All-American game is on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. That is going to continue, but they've started a new format heading into this season where they're actually planning to play a U18 top prospects sort of head-to-head, Canada versus US, CHL versus the NTDP. And as a result, the CHL top prospects game will be no more. But I hit all of those checkpoints. Then if I have a story that I really want to do this year, for example, I went to East Lansing to do a story on Artem Levshunov in the fall and sort of embedded with the Michigan State Spartans as part of the rejuvenation of that program. So stories like that, I typically throw in 2 or 3 other trips a year on top of the major events that I have to be at. And then when I'm at home, I'm in OHL rinks, normally about once a week on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, occasionally a Wednesday. I'll get out to an OHL game, try to show face and see those kids as much as possible. And then my week is typically 2 days of video and 3 days of interviews and writing and sort of publishing stuff. So I typically like Thursday and Friday. Sometimes it's just Friday, but Thursday and Friday, if I'm done filed my stories from the week, I'll sit down and pull up Instat and watch kids over in Europe and that kind of a thing. And I try to dedicate 2 out of 5 days a week just to watching video and taking notes on these kids to make sure that I'm on top of who's who and who's on the rise and that kind of a thing. So lucky that way, where when I'm not on the road, we all get to work from home. We don't have a dedicated office space or anything that we have to go to. So just try to get into OHL rinks. Last year, there was a kid locally at SAC, Dean Letourneau, who was playing at St. Andrews College, who was a potential first-round pick. So SAC's, I mean, I grew up across the street from SAC, so went and saw Dean play a few times at SAC and that kind of a thing. And that's pretty much the schedule every week, is try to get into the rink once or twice, and then when I'm not in the rink, it's phone calls and video and writing.
How do you evaluate a kid playing in such a non-traditional league to be a first round talent, but not see them against that kind of competition?
Yeah, typically those kids get to go down on their Christmas break and then at the end of the season to play in the USHL. So you at least get a little bit of them against a better competition. Dean did do that. He went down on his Christmas break and played 2 games in the USHL. But when he was supposed to go down at the end of the season, he'd actually hurt his shoulder. He'd blown out his shoulder. And so he didn't get to go down and play those 7, 8 more games in the USHL that some guys typically do. And as a result, the book on Dean in particular was really small. Now, the benefit is there's been a kid who's come through SAC basically once a year, once every other year for the last 7 or 8 years. So you've got 3 or 4 other players from SAC that you can measure him against. And then on the flip side, SAC plays a much better schedule now than they used to. SAC actually was part of creating the Prep Hockey Conference, which has some very good schools, including Shattuck St. Mary's, who obviously produce players every year for the draft and had 3 more this year who were in consideration for the draft. So that you get some measuring stick games that way, but it's hard. It's an imperfect science with a player like Dean Letourneau, and is even more complicated by the fact that he's 6'7" and was one of the most unique prospects in this draft, forgetting the league that he played in. So it's going to be fascinating to see him at Boston College next year, because it's a big jump to go from SAC directly into BC. He actually wasn't initially going to go to BC until Will Smith turned pro and was going to San Jose. They didn't have a roster spot for him. So when I did my feature on Dean, he told me he was going next season to play for in the USHL. So him going directly into BC now that Will Smith is turning pro with San Jose is going to be really interesting.
A guy you saw at the showcase was Zeev Byam, a guy I know Minnesota Wild fans are hyped about. And you did the winners and losers of the draft for one of your stories. The Wild were one of the winners, especially from day one. Just what struck you the most about that pick, and what do you like about Zeev in terms of how he could fit?
I mean, I think Zeev's a star. Zeev was 4th on my list, obviously. So I believe that wherever they got him with 13, 12. That he was one of the picks of the draft, frankly. Zeev is arguably the best player. Last year was arguably the best player, best defenseman I've ever watched at that age at the college hockey level. He was better than the Hughes brothers. He was better than Owen Power. He was better than Zach Werenski, Charlie McAvoy, Seth Jones, you name it. He had an all-time teenaged freshman year in college. He's extremely mobile. He's got sort of the defining quality of his game offensively is his sort of shoulder fakes and head fakes. He makes a lot of guys miss. He sort of walks the line and beats guys off the line extremely, extremely well. And that was always a big part of his game at the program, but really found another level last year. And then beyond that, what really elevated him last year was his defensive play and his ability to lock guys up. He was unbelievable against BC and BU in the Frozen Four. I mean, you were there. He was outstanding. And locked up Macklin Celebrini, locked up that top line for BC with Will Smith, Gabe Perreault, and Ryan Leonard. Like he just glued himself to those guys defensively with his footwork and made it so hard on them. And there's actually a little bit of Brock Faber that way, where Brock has always relied on his footwork. Now, Zeev at this age is way ahead of where Brock was in terms of offensive talent. They both have the skating. They're both about the same size. They both defend at a very high level. Brock was probably a little bit more polished defensively, but offensively, Zeev has another level, and I think will eventually bump Brock off of PP1 and become the PP1 guy for the Wild. So, like, I think he's got like 60. Like, I think we're talking like 60-point upside. Like, I think we're looking at a star player here if he continues on the path that he's been on over the last year.
Dang. And I mean, the Wild have been spoiled with Brock Faber, Calder runner-up. Don't tell them that, but he came in and set pretty wild expectations for a first-year defenseman. And granted, he did that off his junior year. What do you expect for Zeev Buium's timeline? Like, is he going to play one more year, come out this spring, and off to the races? Or when do you expect him to actually grab an NHL spot?
No, I think that's the timeline you're looking at. I think he goes back for his sophomore year. He signs and turns pro in the spring. He's immediately in the Minnesota Wild lineup. I don't know whether he'll play big minutes right away. Oftentimes when those guys get in for the last 5 or 10 games of the year, they get eased in a little bit. And I think that's probably the right play for him. But he's going to be the number 1 D for USA at the World Juniors. They've got the rare opportunity to go back-to-back. USA has never won back-to-back golds at the World Juniors. I think they and Canada are the favorites again this year. And so he's going to be the guy there. He could be the tournament MVP at the World Juniors if things break right for him. He's going to play 30 minutes there. He's going to play 30 minutes at Denver under an excellent coach who is coincidentally his coach for the World Junior team, and David Carl. And then I expect him to come out and play, and if not be an impact guy right away, then I wouldn't be surprised if he's an impact guy in 2025, 2026 as sort of his first full season and in the Rookie of the Year conversation. And that, like, I think that's the caliber of player that we're talking about.
What can we expect from like a healthy Ryder Ritchie?
Yeah, Ryder's an interesting one. Obviously, has played some really good hockey in spurts over the course of the last 2 years. Creative, crafty player, good skater, good skill, but just hasn't maybe met expectations relative to what he looks like when you watch him. Like, you watch him play and you think that's an excellent skater. That's a really skilled player. He should be more productive than he is. And part of that is the injury troubles and some bad breaks. Obviously wasn't a part of the World Junior conversation this time around. I don't expect that he will be even in December. Even if he gets off to a great start, he's probably not going to be in the conversation given how deep this Canadian team is. But 2 years from now, that's when you're looking at Ryder Ritchie and saying, okay, as a 19-year-old, can he be a 100-point guy in the WHL and the kind of player who's on the Canadian World Junior team in his final year of junior? So still a 2-year process. He's going to play junior the next 2 seasons. And then you sort of go from there with him. But I think if he's developed properly, you're looking at a middle 6 winger who adds some secondary offense. I think that's the hope.
We'll do some fact or fiction with this claim from the Wild 4th round pick, the Finnish young defenseman, Aaron Karu. I think it's Karu who told
maybe.
Yeah, I'm a Finn too, so I should be able to get that pronunciation right. Who told Bill Guerin you got the steal of the draft?
Yeah.
Now, you may not call him the steal of the draft since there's a lot of players in the draft, but like how off or on is his assessment from where he landed and what he can be?
Well, I mean, I think PB Haru should have been a 2nd round pick in this draft. And so obviously getting him in the 4th is great value for me. Obviously a very, very complicated development path over the last year. The knee injury really sort of set him back. His skating has also been the concern about Aaron traditionally. So the fact that he hurt his knee and then when he came back at U18 Worlds, he looked a little slow. That just raised some red flags for teams. You've got a 5'9" defenseman who isn't a high-end skater and has missed significant time due to injury. But in saying that, I mean, there were players picked ahead of him in the 4th round there that I don't think have any chance of getting signed, let alone playing in the NHL. And Aaron Kiviharju is going to be a first pairing defenseman for the Finnish World Junior team this year. He's going to get signed by the Minnesota Wild. He's going to at least be an AHL power play defenseman. He would have been a full-time defenseman in Liga last year. I spoke with the coaching staff there. They said he easily, quote, easily was a top 6 defenseman for that team in the fall before he got injured. So I love that. It's exactly the kind of value play I think teams should be making at that range in the draft. And coincidentally, I mean, I know you're a Finn as well. They're just speaking of the World Junior Summer Showcase. There could be 3 Wild prospects on that team. Kiviharju's a lock. He could be the captain of that team. Rasmus Kumpalainen is going to be a middle 6 center, I would think, for that team, and is also absolutely a lock. And then Sebastian Soini was at the World Junior Summer Showcase this week and was shockingly not on the U18 team. I heard there was just a bit of a rift between him and the coach. The coach didn't like him, hadn't liked what he'd seen of him previously. There were actually members of the Finnish Hockey Federation who were saying that he should have been on that team privately and that they made a mistake. There were teammates of his on that Finnish U18 team who said that he should have been on that team. And now, lo and behold, 3 months later, he has been invited to play at the World Junior Summer Showcase, even though he wasn't on the U18 team prior. So Soini is a player who I think, because he's a righty and they're a little light on righties for this age group for the Finns, he could be on that team as well. So you're going to have all sorts of, plus we haven't even talked about Riley Heidt and others. You're going to have all sorts of wild flair, I think, at this year's tournament.
Yeah, and forgive the pun, but speaking of Height, gotta ask, is really the only difference between you and your colleague Corey Pronman that you don't embrace height discrimination?
Well, me and Corey do view it a little bit differently that way. He tends to value, you're right, the size component more than I do. And we've had some really good debates over some players in recent draft classes that we've disagreed on. A player like Zach Benson, for example, that I was really high on, that Corey was lower on. And then on the flip side, some of the bigger guys that I was lower on. So it does create for some good debates. Certainly, I think size is a premium specifically for defensemen. I think it matters less and less up front, frankly. But still is, I mean, there's a reason that the St. Louis Blues and the Tampa Bay Lightning and the Vegas Golden Knights teams that won the Stanley Cup looked the way that they did on the blue line and were so successful with the length that they had, all 3 of those teams in particular. But then you've got the Colorado Avalanche, who have 4 of their top 6 defensemen are 5'10", and 5'11", right? So there's different ways to build a team, and I think you get into trouble when you get carried away with size. I mean, we've seen Olin Zellweger, Lane Hudson, Logan Stankoven, the guys who tend to be the steals, the real risers from each draft class, tend to be those smaller skilled guys. And those guys I still think have a role to play, especially if their skill level is sort of the elite level. So I've always been high on the Lane Hudsons and the Zellwegers and the Stankovens. They were really, really high on my lists. I've also been too high on some smaller guys over the years too. So there's a balancing act that way.
Speaking of height, I mean, do you think he's a guy who can play in the NHL this year? I know how that decision will have to make in the first 9 games, and I'm surprised he fell 64 as it was, and he can definitely be an NHL player. But
yeah, I don't think he's quite there, honestly. I think another season back in the WHL isn't the worst thing in the world for him. I don't even think he's a lock. And based off of what some of the things that some of the staff with Hockey Canada said at the World Junior Summer Showcase this week, I think there's mixed opinions even within Hockey Canada on Riley Heidt. He wasn't good for them at U18 Worlds in his draft year. Now, that was a long time ago, but it's the same, by and large, the same management group that's making these decisions. Those things do linger. And I think even Dave Cameron talked about his inconsistency this week. I thought Riley was great this week at the World Junior Summer Showcase. I thought he was one of the most noticeable players for Hockey Canada offensively in particular. He was blocking shots. He was physically engaged. He's got a little bit of a chip on his shoulder these days, I think, because folks at Hockey Canada and others don't view him maybe in the regard that someone like I do. I had him as a first-round player in his draft year. Obviously, he wasn't taken in the first round, but that's where I had him rated. And I ultimately, I mean, we've got our World Junior World Junior roster projections for the Big Four countries. Corey, Max, and I have put together a sort of a mini panel and decided on projected rosters. And we do have Height on our projected roster, but he's not a lock. The way that we broke it down, there are up front of the 13 forwards, there are 9 locks, which means there's really only, because of how many returnees there are 9 locks. So including Gavin McKenna, the star 2026 prospect in that group as well. So that means there's really only 4 jobs to be won. And you start to look at the list. I mean, we've got TJ Ginla off our roster. We've got Beckett Seneke off our roster. We've got Andrew Crystal, one of the leading scorers in the WHL the last 2 seasons, off our roster. And so could one of those guys make the team over Riley Heidt? Absolutely. There's going to be some big names left off this Canadian World Junior team. But at the end of the day, I still think Height's going to be on that team. And you go from there. I think you spend a year in the WHL. Hopefully he goes to the World Juniors and makes an impact for a deep Canada. And then the following season is when you really sort of challenge. Now, if they want to give him 9 games, they should give him 9 games and see how he does. I mean, Boston did that with Matt Poitras last year, and then Matt Poitras stuck around all year, right? So those guys do have a way of figuring it out, and smart players, and Riley Heidt is an extremely smart player. Smart players can play with other good players, even if they're maybe not ready in other ways. So I wouldn't be surprised if he looked fine in 9 games and stuck around a little or that kind of thing, and then was lent out to the World Juniors and spent the second half in the WHL. That's often a path for some of those kids. So, but he'll be one to watch in training camp for sure.
Yeah. And like you said, you definitely weren't alone in giving him a first round grade. And a lot of Wild fans have talked themselves into him essentially being the first round pick from that draft class. I'm not sure how closely you saw it, but I imagine you're at least somewhat aware of the turmoil from the Charlie Stramel selection.
Yeah.
Can you talk about just what you see in Charlie as a prospect and what we need to see this year as he transitions over to Michigan State to, really deem it a successful season?
Yeah, I mean, it's been tough. Obviously, I was lower on Stramel to begin with, but in saying that, I understood at the time why people were so excited about him. He was injured and missed a good chunk of time throughout his 2 years at the program. But right before his second of 2 injuries at the program, he looked like maybe even a top 10 pick. They called him the big rig. He was this big, strong kid. He could absolutely rip the puck. He moved fine for his size, and he was just a freak athlete who could really impose himself as a centerman on games. Then he gets back healthy. He's never really a top player on that team after that point. He became kind of a 4th line center for that team, 3rd, 4th line center for that team. He was also playing up, a sort of up in age group, if you will, because he was a late birthday. He wasn't with his draft class worth of players. He was ahead of them. But then he goes to Wisconsin, and Wisconsin, I thought, was in a big transition period. That program was a mess, frankly. One of the messiest programs in college hockey. They changed the coaching staff. I've got a ton of respect for the new coaching staff, but it was a work in progress, and he kind of got caught on a roster influx with the Badgers and just didn't really look himself. Then he also got injured again and missed some time, and it's just been a rough couple of years for him, and he hasn't looked, especially offensively, like he's got it, and he just wasn't imposing himself on games in the same way. So now he gets to hit the restart button, and you just hope he can become an NHL player. I think that is ultimately, if he plays NHL games, that's what you're measuring success by now. He's got to get signed first, though. He's got so many steps he's got to take here. He's going to have to play in the AHL and prove himself in the AHL. He's going to have to play well enough in college to get signed. But I think as far as this season goes, if he can be a 20 points in 30 game guy, I think that's what you're hoping for. He's not all of a sudden going to be a point per game first line offensive player, but if he can just be a regular contributor offensively and not the bit of a black hole that he was at Wisconsin offensively, if he can be a second power play guy and score 8 or 9 goals in college, it's hard to score 10 goals in Division I. It really is. 10 goals is the barometer for a good season for any player, no matter whether you're a first round pick or undrafted guy. 10 goals is kind of what any coach will tell you is a good season. If he can score 10 goals and 20 points, that would be a great step forward for him. And just play with a little more pace. He needs to show that he can play with more pace.
We have some fan questions on Twitter. Try to get wrapped through some of these quick ones for you. We know you're off. We'll come back over to the North America next year. We have a fan who asked, could he play in the Wild's top 6 this year if he did come over?
I think the answer is probably yes. His move from the wing to center and how good he looked at center last year completely changed his trajectory. Europe was a player who I had in my top 10 in his draft year, so he's a player I've always been really high on, but he just never seemed to get the looks and the power play time and the puck touches that he needed when he was on the wing at the KHL level. Certainly at the junior level, whether he was playing wing or not, he was going to dominate because of his skill level, because he's got decent size. He's an incredibly smart player. All of those things made him a dominant player against his peers. But there was really 3 years there where he just wasn't involved with the KHL team. And then I started to worry about his development. Last year was kind of like, okay, if he can't play 15 minutes a night for them, if they're going to play him 6 minutes a night again, his development is going to be in trouble. Like, his progress is going to be hindered by the fact that he spent, then it would have been 4 seasons basically of toiling away in the KHL. So the fact that they moved him to center and then he just seemed to find a role on that team, and he was excellent right away as a center, I think because of the smarts piece, he just made it work. It changed everything. Now you've got a potential center. He's obviously a natural winger, but I think he's going to be a center now. Like, that's a big deal. So, and then obviously the production and being the team's leading scorer and all of that is huge deal for a player that age in the KHL. Now, I don't think the KHL now post-war is what it was. They aren't getting the same level of imports. They aren't getting as many AHL players coming over. So it's predominantly a Russian league now. And I mean, there are still North Americans over there and some good ones, but I do think the level of the KHL is a little bit lower now than it was. So some of those records that some of these kids are breaking, like Michkov and Yurov, I think you do have to take with a bit of a grain of salt. But I mean, he still did it. He still went out there and was one of the best players on a night-to-night basis as a center in a top professional league at an early age. Like, he's a stud. I think he's got legit top 6 upside. Like, he's going to be an impact. I'm not sure he's going to be a true star player. Like, I don't think you're getting Kaprizov kind of thing, but I think he's going to be an impact guy in the NHL.
So would you view him as like tops of the prospect pool for the Wild, or like who would you label loosely as your top 3 guys in the pool today?
Oh, he's the top forward prospect, no question. I mean, it depends how you rate Jesper Wallstedt. But I think it's Wallstedt and Yurov right now are they're sort of 2 top guys, and then Bouillon is obviously on D is in a stratosphere of his own.
Who's the most underrated player in the prospect pool?
Oh, well, I don't know if Heidt is underrated at this point. I know certainly from the mentions I get about him from Wild fans, he's not underrated in the state of Minnesota. But I do think Heidt maybe feels a little bit that way to me. I think Kivi Harju, based off of where he was drafted, is a little underrated. That obviously I'm sure you guys have talked about it, but the D in Iowa had a tough go last season. So I don't know whether any of those players are underrated at the moment, because they actually really did struggle by and large. I thought Lambos was better later in the year. Hunt is obviously an option. He's made himself at least an NHL option now. But I don't know, maybe Kivi Harju for me.
On the blue line, just like you said, not a great year. Looking at their development, like, that was a year where it was a pretty young team, inexperienced. That's not going to bode well when you have a very, very green blue line.
Yeah.
Do you expect to see them take significant steps this year, or do you think that last year is indicative of some of these guys maybe not having what it takes?
Well, I am starting to worry about O'Rourke. O'Rourke's a kid that I thought maybe had a real opportunity for a long time to be kind of a hard-nosed, physical numbers 5 to 7 defenseman in the NHL who had a 300-400 game career and was a decent depth defenseman. I'm not sure now that he has that. I would expect I do still think there might be something in Lambos. He's obviously had the health complications when he was in the WHL that sort of set him back. He also was a pandemic player who had to go over and play in Finland in his draft year. And I think all of those kids who had to go over to Europe or stayed and didn't play at all, like a Wyatt Johnston, those guys, they just had unique paths. They've had to navigate it a little bit differently than your typical draft class would have to. I think we're seeing it with players like Brennan Othman in New York. Like, guys are just taking a little bit longer, with Wyatt Johnston honestly being the exception to that, maybe. So I think Lambeau still has a chance. I like Spacek. Like, there are some potential options there, but I think that's what you're hoping for out of those guys, like a Spacek or a Lambeau. You're hoping they become options. I don't think you're expecting them to become options. So it's a bit of a recalibration that way, where typically you take a kid like Lambeau's in the first round and you pencil him in as, okay, this kid's going to be one of our top 6D in the future. Now you're hoping he does rather than expecting him to be.
Last one from the Twitter fan questions is, how many Wild prospects do you see as impact NHL players, like a top 6 forward, top 4D? I mentioned Wallstedt would be number 1 goalie, but like, of the guys you have in the prospect pool right now, how many of them are top 6 guys, top 4D?
Well, I think the big three, like, Yurov's going to be a top 6 guy. Boyum, I think, is going to be a first pairing defenseman. I still believe Jesper Wallstedt's going to be a starting goalie in the league. So those are your 3 big ones. I like Ogren to become a potential second line guy. He might be sort of a scoring third line guy. Like, that might be his future. I'm not sure he maybe has quite enough offense. Certainly he can shoot the puck, but I'm not sure he's that cerebral enough a playmaker to be a 50-point winger in the NHL, like a second line, like a surefire second line winger. But if Liam Ogren had a career as a 20-20-40 guy and made $4 million a year, $3.5-4 million a year in the NHL, like, I think that would still be a good outcome for Liam Ogren. I think he's got that in him. So Ogren, I expect to get there. After that, I don't think there's a lot that way. Guys like Hunter Haight and Riley Heidt, like, Heights would be that sort of next guy. Murat, I think, is probably a third liner. Height, I think, is a unique one where he's going to have to be an offensive power play guy. He's going to have to play with other talented players to be at his best. Like Riley Heights, despite the fact that he's a pretty competitive kid and he has that chip on his shoulder that I mentioned, I don't think Riley's going to be a checker in the NHL. So he's got a little bit of a boomer bust projection that way, where I could see him becoming that classic high-end AHL point guy who maybe takes some time to figure it out in the NHL. But Height would be, after those big 4, Height would be the next guy. Guys like Hunter Haight and Rasmus Kumpulant, like, those guys they're depth pieces, right? So I think that those 5 guys, the big 4 plus Height, would probably be the guys that I would say you should be, like, for sure excited about being a part of the future.
Nice.
Awesome.
How's the golf game, Scott?
The golf game is getting better. The golf game used to be like 105 to 110 on a good course. Like, I was a below average golfer, and I'm starting to break 100 here, which has been exciting for me. So the golf game is improving. I hit them straight. It's just I'm 5'11" and 170 pounds. It's the distance. Like, we're looking at 200 yards off the tee kind of thing, and the irons are 150. Like, I just don't have the power to really smack it. So been working on the chipping, and the rest of the game is fine. So I'm getting there. I'm starting to feel like I can actually golf well, which is what it's all about.
Even his golf scouting report sounds like a Rink Net report. You got your scouting report on your own golf game like that.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we've got our last question here.
Final question, brought to you as always by our good friends at Waggle Golf. First, make sure you head over to getyourwaggleon.com, throw in promo code SP10 to take 10% off your entire order.
Scott, who is in your dream golf foursome? So dead or alive, celebrity, athlete,
Yeah.
your mom, like,
Yeah.
who are the 3 guys that round out your foursome?
Well, my grandfather Wilf would be one of them. He was a huge golfer, but died when I was sort of in late elementary school, early high school. So I never actually got to play with him. But it's all like, it was his true love. He played into his 80s kind of thing, into his late 70s. He was a member at courses and that kind of a thing. It was his thing. So getting to play with him, he'd probably be in that mix. And then I actually worked at the PGA Tour. I worked for the Canadian side of the PGA Tour, which at the time was called the Mackenzie Tour. which is sort of right below the web. And at the time, there were some unbelievable sort of golfers who came through, who I got to know, sort of developed a bit of a relationship with. So all of the top Canadian golfers, guys like Corey Connors, Mackenzie Hughes, they were all on the tour when I was working for the tour, on the Mackenzie tour, that is. And then you had guys like Taylor Gooch and others who are now sort of PGA Tour players who've risen in the ranks. But sort of some of those Canadian guys some of the current Canadian guys I'd love to have around with. Certainly Mike Weir is obviously the Canadian legend, if you will, in the game up here. But I'd love to play around with Corey and Mac Hughes and my grandfather. That would probably be it.
Awesome. I love the family stuff too. You've had people who've mentioned some family members in there, which has been great. A lot of people pick like Tiger Woods or
of course,
famous, or famous actors and stuff like that. But it's a tough one. Me and Scott did our own. It was really tough to do.
Yeah, certainly Bill Murray's. I'm a big Bill Murray guy as well, so I'm sure he's come up in some of your answers.
As Carl Spackler.
But thank you so much for joining us off your vacation here. I know everybody, the Wild fans, are excited about this last year's draft and the guys that they have coming, and in theory, some cap space after next year to spend to add around them. So, but thanks so much. We'll catch up with you during the season after some major events maybe, and follow up. So thanks, Scott.
Cool. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Oh boy, Joe, gotta thank Scott again for giving us, what was that, like 40 minutes of great conversation. I don't know. Hopefully everyone listened to that and like has a little bit better level set understanding of like what some of these prospects are, what to expect. But everyone's going to have their own opinions, and that's totally fine.
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of the prospects that you guys asked about, the big name ones, and also the Ryder Richies of the world and the guys from this year's draft. And I think Scott asked about the defenseman in Iowa. Like, there's still some hope for them and that kind of thing. I thought Scott had a pretty good measured answer on those guys. And so, yeah, I think prospects are exciting for fans to watch because they're the unknown. The fun of the unknown is kind of cool, exciting to think about picturing these guys like Hunter Hayde and Riley Heidt. They, Kumpalainen, what might happen to him, but it's easy to see guys like Faber and Bouillon, but it's harder to see ones that maybe are under the surface. They may not be the blue chip prospect, but the guys that'll eventually become big guys in their team. Like I covered Tampa Bay, and Tyler Johnson wasn't a huge prospect at the time, and he became a Calder Trophy finalist. And Yanni Gourde wasn't a known prospect, and all of a sudden he became a key part of two cup teams. So you never know who will kind of come out of the woodwork there in the development system, which is why it's so important to have guys like Scott writing for us at The Athletic, and Corey Proman did a heck of a job covering prospect at the draft. It almost comes for us at the draft. We kind of see what happens, but we always tap into their expertise. Like, oh, who the heck is this guy? Aside from like the Bouillons and top, 10 picks, people know, but get the fourth round, they pick somebody like, who the hell is this guy? And those guys at a minute notice have always, I've seen them play.
It's crazy.
I've seen them play on video and this and this. I'm like, all right, well, I trust them a lot more than I would trust a lot of people following these guys.
Yeah. And I mean, we did the way too early 2025 rankings a couple weeks ago on Judd's Buds. We only got through 16, and that was like a stretch because it is just way too early. Scott Wheeler's already out with his top 32, ready to go. Like, no big deal. He's like, yeah, here we are.
It's like the draft's over, and then the next day it's like, okay, what's next? It's like coaches after a season, like, oh, you guys won the national championship? Okay, when's recruiting start? It's gonna the next year starts like that.
We're ready for it. But all right, final segment of the show every week. Thank you to our great friends over at Barrel Theory Beer Co. Again, everyone go check them out, support them. They've got new beer releases all summer. They got food trucks lining up on the regular. I know Wednesday night apparently is an absolutely poppin' bingo night. Timmy said that we've got to make it out there for one of these. We'll see. Maybe we'll work our way in. But and it sounds like there's going to be a little bit of a change up. Some new beers that might be offered at the X this year. So we'll make sure we bring you all that as the season approaches. But Joe, Barrel Theory brings us Keyboard Warriors, and this one is not going to be from the keyboard necessarily. This one's going to be through the microphone. We're calling out some of our good friends here on the podcast, the Bar Down Beauties, Jesse and Kirsten. Guys, listen to your show that dropped today. Saying that Utah is going to come in last in the Central to me is a scathing hot take. I'm sure there are plenty that completely agree with you and think that there's nothing going on in Utah. Maybe we think that Chicago got enough better to jump them. Joe, I'll go to you first before I get any deeper in this, but thoughts on the idea of Utah finishing last in the Central?
Was that one of their hot take segments? Was that one of their hot takes that it's gonna happen? I would be I would be absolutely stunned if Utah is in last place, and that's not because, just all the hype of making over the new team and like maybe some additions they got. I did like a lot of the guys they got in the offseason, including Mikhail Sergachev, a guy I covered in Tampa. They were such a good team last year until the franchise kind of fell apart in Phoenix, where they were kind of it really devastated them. I think they lost like 12 straight after that. That's the thing that a lot of people don't realize, though. They just look and they say, "Oh, hot start," and then they just like fell apart. Like, no. This is a team that was dismantled by just a horrible. It was torn apart. It's torn apart. Like you watched any of the Wilds and Coyotes game last year. Though, for the first time in forever, it seemed like the Coyotes gave them a lot of trouble the whole entire season. Yeah. So the division got a lot better. So I think somebody has to finish last, right? So I get that whole point, but I would be more surprised if they weren't in contention for one of those wild card spots than if they finished.
So you're with me on that. Okay. This is way too early. We got to wait and see how everything shuffles out and we get into the preseason, whatever. I might have Utah penciled in as my 4.
4?
They might be my 4. They might be that high.
Well, there's Dallas. There's Avalanche. Okay.
Nashville.
And then Winnipeg just falls off.
It's not even that I think that middle group is going to be tight.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not saying that they're going to be leaps and bounds better than Minnesota, than Winnipeg, than St. Louis, but I do think that they're the ones that come out with what you said there with their blue line is vastly improved with Sergachev and with Marino. Their young forwards have one more year of experience. They have a new lease on life getting out of that disaster. And again, Phoenix hockey isn't a disaster. Alex Morello is a disaster. Yeah. They escaped that. They've got a new market that's excited to have them, embracing them. They've got an owner that's going to support them. They're going to feel like a real NHL team getting the amenities. And I think their goaltending is a little underrated by the public too. I just think that there's so much working in their direction of improvement. And if they had continued on the pace that they started last year, like, this is a team that we're talking about being not necessarily making the playoffs, but at least in the discussion later in the year, because we know how much Gary Bettman loves his parody and having as many teams in the mix as possible. I like them more. I think Winnipeg got a touch worse. I'm not sure what the coaching change will do. In Minnesota, I don't know what to make of yet. Like, I do think if they can stay completely healthy, there's a lot of reason to think that they could be vying for a wild card spot or like popping over Utah in my rankings. I think the top 3 are pretty set, barring catastrophic injuries. I think for me, it's Dallas, Nashville, Colorado.
Yeah. And then Nashville, I mean, that's putting a lot into their summer acquisitions, right? And they were good last year. Yeah, and assuming Stamkos is healthy and March or so, Brady Shea, like they've added a lot to that team. I like the culture that they're building there with Barry Trotz and Bruno. So, but if you're just assuming that they're in there, I think there's going to be those 4 teams behind them that will be all vying either for 3B or like that wild card. And could the 2 wild cards come from the Central? We asked that a couple of podcasts ago, right? That would mean there'd be one of the teams from the Pacific, 4-4. Coming out. So, injuries will play a lot of roles in some teams that are like, we think St. Louis will be better, but who knows? So I think Minnesota will be in a dogfight overall.
We'll see how these offer sheets play out.
Yeah, I love it.
Just say I love that someone's got the balls to bring offer sheets back. I love it.
Yeah, it's something that'll spice up our August as far as from our writer's perspective. But haven't seen one of those. Don't see those very often. So
are we going to get the rivals quarrel now, though? Like the whole thing that happened with Montreal and Carolina. Like Carolina threw a weird offer sheet over to oh man, why am I forgetting his name now? 3rd overall pick, center.
Svechnikov?
Nope.
Yeah.
So they went for Aho and failed. Yeah. And then they're like, fine, we're going to stick it to you. We're coming back. So like, what's Edmonton's move to counteract this? That could be fun. That could be fun.
Who are they going to go for in St. Louis?
They're going to snatch Ryan Suter out from him. God dang.
I don't know if you can offer sheet a guy who's been bought out 3 times.
No.
I don't know. But
if anyone can, it's Ryan Suter.
he can play for every single team in the league, and
what a wild world.
What a wild world it is. But yeah,
no, but in all seriousness, obviously love Jesse and Kirsten. If you guys don't listen to Bar Down Beauties, go check them out. But this one needed to be called out. I know Jesse will fire back, warranted, but this one I couldn't let stand because I'm actually really high on Utah.
Yeah, and I'm happy if Jesse then want to take one of our hot takes and rip it apart too. But yeah, it's the fun is in seeing how it happens the rest of the year, and then potentially we're all on tape here. Maybe we'll eat our words and they'll be.
I've done that many times. It's okay. Awesome. Well, again, thank you, Barrel Theory, for bringing us that spicy segment. Joe, anything coming up? I mean, now that you're back on the job, I mean, you're out here for the day covering Gopher stuff, but anything coming up for you and Russo that people need to be lying in waiting for from the Athletic?
Well, as of this pod, we'll have a story up with Wheeler's comments on a lot of the prospects that we talked to on our podcast. So look out for that. I'm working on a goaltending story for what the Wild plan to do going into the season. One of the more intriguing parts of their lineup that we don't really know too much about, or expect the workload for Marc-Andre Fleury and I guess for Wallstedt. I looked into historical info and talked to some goalies who played into their 40s and goalies who have played young players in a NHL workload, how much do they play. So that's one of them, and Russo and I will have a collaboration coming up to our takes on the off season. We'll do that too sometime before he goes to Prague for the European NHL media tour, or after it, one of the two. But we'll have a lot more off season stuff coming for that leading into the training camp, which, can't believe it or not, is about a month away.
Love it. And everyone, as always, if you're new to the show, we'd really appreciate it if you subscribe, 5 stars, whatever it is you can do, let people know. Definitely check out the YouTube. If you're into the video, we'll have full interview video for you every week, of course, but we'll throw in clips of shorter ones if you're looking for, digestible couple-minute clips. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got the prospect pool rankings coming out every week. We started with 21 through 25 last week. This week, you can be looking out for 16 through 20, and we'll be rolling that out through the rest of the summer. That'll all be on YouTube or on Judd's Buds. But otherwise, Joe, as long as everyone, subscribes, 5 stars to everything, they're members of the Athletic, not much more we can ask you guys. Support our good friends at Waggle Golf, like always. And of course, if you haven't tried Barrel Theory beer yet, you'll thank me as soon as you do.
Thanks so much, guys, for listening and following along and commenting and all that stuff. And we'll talk to you guys next week.
You stay classy, stay to hockey.